Greetings from Toronto as people are joining Change for Good. We'll give everyone a few minutes to start, but those people who have already signed on, you already are seeing something which we want to share with everyone, which is a conference coming up on from June 8th to 12th that the AVPN is putting on online, called The Power of Networks. So I encourage everyone to check that out and to participate. And you can, with the code that's on the screen, everyone can get a complimentary ticket. So they're an incredible organization, and I encourage everyone to check this out. And we're going to talk more about that later. Anyway, we are here in Toronto, as I said. It's May 21st, and welcome to the next episode of Change for Good. Today, I have the super great pleasure and privilege of speaking with Naina Subberwal Batra, who's the Chairperson and CEO of AVPN, which is an amazing funders network, which is based in Singapore, which is connecting people all across Asia to social impact through a lens of investment. So welcome, Naina.
Thank you, Paul. I am really excited and happy to be here. So thank you so much for the invitation.
It's my pleasure and privilege. I had the last time we saw each other was in Seoul. And we were both guests and speakers at a fantastic conference put on, I think it was by the SK Happiness Foundation, right?
That's correct. That's correct. We both spoke, and it was quite an amazing experience. Yes. Well,
we'll do that again. But your conference is virtual this year. We were talking earlier. Hopefully, next year it'll be different. But as you know, we started Change for Good. This is now, I think, the ninth episode of Change for Good. Mm-hmm. We started this because we really felt it was important in the context of the super fast change that's happening all around the world to have a place for people involved in social change to have a sense of community and a sense of inspiration, and to do that by having conversations with people like Naina. So that's why we're doing this. And I also want to share with everybody that even though I'm having the conversation with Naina and asking questions, it's not just about me. It's really an opportunity for everybody here listening to ask the questions as well. And Naina's looking forward to your questions too. So as I always say, don't hold back. If you think of anything, put it in. We'll get to as many questions as we can. Naina, you're based in Singapore. Mm-hmm. Your organization is working and has a in-depth knowledge of the situation all over Asia. But first I wanted to hear, and I think we'd love to hear from you personally about how you're coping with this. What's the situation for you and your family over there?
So Singapore is under what we call a circuit breaker. So that is our version of a lockdown. So we have been in a circuit breaker condition since the 2nd of April. It's been pretty much later than a lot of countries in Asia, but Singapore had a second wave of the virus. And so we went into circuit breaker. We were supposed to get off on the 4th of May, but we have extended it till the 2nd of June. So me and most of my team that is working in Singapore are all working from home, and it's a new experience because everything other than essential services like grocery stores or medical stores are shut, and Singapore, which is a big sort of international hub, it's a big trading community. All flights are shut, all airports are shut, the borders are shut. So it's a very different and unique situation for us here in Singapore, much like all over the world.
And I think the other thing that we're also interested in is as people who lead organizations, and you're Chairperson and CEO of AVPN, how is that changing how you're working with your team, or can you share anything about how that's looking or what you're doing differently?
So I think it's been very it's been a steep learning curve.
Mm.
I mean, we've all talked about, you know, sort of flexible work and working virtually, but this was sort of being really thrown into the deep end. So AVPN is present in 16 different markets, and other than Singapore, Hong Kong, and India, most of our staff everywhere else does work from home. And this has given us in headquarters a very first-hand sort of idea of what they go through. So it's no longer just sorting out things by just talking to a coworker who's in the same office. You have to schedule a Zoom call, or you need to send an email, and you need to be very thoughtful about, you know, how many requests you're putting in, or how you are actually addressing problems. So in some ways, it's been like I said, something to get used to. But I also see this as a huge opportunity, Paul. You know, we have really embraced technology in all shapes and forms. And I think, like us, our members have also embraced technology. And I don't think there is going back from this. I think everybody can now, you know, sort of work remotely. I don't think there's things we can't do because we can't meet in person. We have been able to manage quite well. So I feel it is a huge opportunity going forward. Of course, things can't replace personal contact and being able to actually see people face to face versus across the screen, as you and I are doing right now. But you know, it's equally great connecting with you virtually as it was when we met in person in Seoul. So, you know, it has brought our worlds a lot closer. And for someone who runs a network, that opens up a huge realm of possibilities.
That also, you know, it makes me, you know, you've got this network, you've got members investing in social change all across Asia.
Yeah.
We're here in Toronto, but one of, you know, of course, what we see is that some similarity is that people who are vulnerable before are even more vulnerable. And how, and it may be too early to know, but to the extent that you've seen it so far, how is that affecting, you know, what your members are investing in terms of social change, and how they're doing that? The problems are huge, they're complex, spread over many different countries. What are you seeing that's starting to happen?
So I think, Paul, that's a really you know, important question, because it's in Asia. So AVPN as a network, for those of your listeners who aren't familiar with us, we are a network of funders and resource providers. And we have more than 650 members who come from 36 countries. But for us, the area where they work comprises Asia, and we define Asia pretty broadly, sort of going east from Turkey all the way to Australia and Oceania. But if I look at, you know, the large pockets where our members are active, so if you look at sort of China, Southeast Asia, South Asia, or you know, even East Asia like Japan and Korea, you will see that this virus has not spared any of these countries. In fact, it's led to a substantial contraction in economic activities. And the International Labour Organization has actually predicted that 125 million full-time workers in Asia alone will be out of a job by the end of the second quarter of this year. So that is huge. What we are also finding out, because we are a social investment network, a lot of the investee organizations that our members have invested in, whether they be nonprofits or they be social enterprises, are going out of business as we speak. The organizations that had a short runway don't really have a runway at all. And the organizations that had a medium-term runway are actually now to a very, very short runway. So the question then is, you know, how are you going to preserve livelihoods, and how are you going to preserve jobs? These organizations that were working on a growth mindset, how do they kind of pivot towards a liquidity mindset? If I come to, you know, what our members are doing, like I think a lot of organizations across the world, including in Canada, the immediate funding initiatives are largely focused on medical and frontline help to vulnerable communities. So for instance, the Tanoto Foundation, which is one of our members in Indonesia, has looked at providing a large scale amount of medical supplies. So including sort of flying in through private jet, personal protective equipment to Indonesia. We've also seen collaborative initiatives in relief provision and community support by the Gates Foundation and other members like Temasek and Raintree Foundation in India, in the states of Uttar Pradesh and Bihar, which are amongst the most backward, and most vulnerable in India. We've also sort of seen multiple public and private stakeholders joining hands. So for instance, in Singapore, the Octavia Foundation, which is a family foundation, has partnered with the Ministry of Education to identify funding gaps across families, youth, and children, and are providing emergency funding to students from low-income families. Now, you realize that suddenly a lot of the education has all gone online. So what happens to kids from vulnerable families who can't afford a tablet or a laptop? Who provides that? So that's where members have come in to kind of work together with government to provide support.
And well, thank you for sharing all those specific examples. I'd love to hear more about those as well. And the other thing that makes me think of, one thing that just actually never occurred to me until you mentioned this is that, people who are investing in organizations, and I suppose supporting them philanthropically as well, you never had the expectation that those organizations were going to go out of business.
Right.
And that's a new idea, I think. And I think that's just really struck me when you said that. And the other thing that I'd love to hear a little more about is, I know your organization, of course, has been a leader in advancing how people and businesses can invest in social change in a way which is contributing to more social change and creating a return for them. But one of the things that we've seen here is, feel like in that context, there's also been a bit of a turn back to more pure philanthropy, which I think you just mentioned. And as a way of kind of just getting funds out fast. How are you seeing that kind of spectrum between philanthropy and investing in social change shifting?
So I think, what has happened and logically, a lot of the philanthropic funding has moved to more sort of immediate needs, more humanitarian assistance. What that has had an effect on, unfortunately, is on projects that are looking at long-term systems change and that are looking at, change that doesn't happen immediately, that will take some time. And in very, very important areas like climate action, like gender, like sort of inequalities in livelihood, like sort of distribution of income, all of this, unfortunately, right now seems to be taking a backseat as funders are looking at providing immediate assistance, whether that be in the form of, healthcare, whether that be in the form of supporting research for a vaccine, whether that be in actually looking at providing, like I said, technology support or, laptop support for students coming from low-income communities, whether it's actually in places like India, providing support to a large number of migrant workers who are trying to get back to their homes and back to their communities. But what is really needed, we mentioned briefly earlier about the fact that investee organizations or nonprofits that are supported by some of these funders are going out of business. So how do you actually now it's even more important to move from looking at sort of short-term financial outcomes to a far longer term, more patient outlook and focusing on social impact first. So, we need to have organizations, and I'm happy to say that there are some of our members that are looking to set up emergency funding for these kinds of, their own investees and for other organizations as well, which will look at providing stabilization capital, which will look at providing access to loans, which will help them meet their working capital needs, which will help them meet their fixed cost needs in order to pay salaries, in order to preserve livelihoods. And I think that is very, very important. So we have an organization called COIS India, which looks at social investing, which is looking to set up a unique parallel vehicle for emergency funding of their investee organizations. Responsibility, which is a large fund which is out of Europe but does a lot of work across Asia, is looking to raise $1 billion global fund to provide zero interest loans to, through microfinance institutions to MSMEs and SMEs that are focused on impact. And I think that is very much the need of the hour.
Thank you for sharing that. You mentioned before some of the organizations who are on the ground and doing the work, and you just spoke now about sort of the other side of it. Are there any specific examples that you could share of investors, and whether that be people or specific foundations or businesses, and anything that comes to mind of just some incredible examples of what they're doing or what we could learn from?
No, absolutely. I think, a lot of our investors in our network have actually taken measures to, ensure that capital is being deployed into the social sector. Of course, you have heard from every large DFI that they have announced, a big COVID relief fund, whether that be the Asian Development Bank, whether that be IFC or the World Bank. The problem though, and I'm being very candid here, is the fact that, the money is kind of needed on the ground right now.
Right.
And a lot of these organizations, unfortunately, are not structured to let the money get out of the door fast. The way their approval process is structured, it usually takes, anywhere between 6 to 12 weeks to get an approval, and the organization may not exist in 6 to 12 weeks. So keeping that in mind, what we are finding is that there are investors like Leapfrog, which is looking at providing support to vulnerable and local communities through their investee organizations and, helping to provide this support on the ground immediately. We have members like Citrine Capital, Nonprofit Hub, and Magic, which are supporting social enterprises in Malaysia. What we've also seen is the Umidyar Network, for instance, in India has committed more than $1.4 million, and they've asked organizations on the ground to actually put forward initiatives that are focused at people at the bottom of India's income pyramid, to see how can you actually help them at this point? How can you really help them now? What we're finding is that IIX, which is another AVPN member, which looks at impact investing, has set up an emergency financing facility that's actually providing refundable grants and working capital loans to high impact enterprises that are working in creating sustainable livelihoods. So there are organizations that have put forward, facilities that are available right now. Are they enough? No. Can we do more? Absolutely. I think it's a balancing act between looking at humanitarian relief as well as providing now longer term support.
And so that's an interesting point right there. So, but what are you saying? So to your members who are coming to you and saying, okay, AVPN and Naina, we're doing what we can here. We're putting support into these urgent situations now. But how should we be thinking about the future, and what should we be doing differently? Do you have a sense of, what would you say to someone who's asking you that question today?
So, we are a funders network, and our sort of message to funders out there is that, it's even more important that you stand by your commitments to nonprofits and to social enterprises that you have made. Unfortunately, there are some funders who have sort of switched their funding from what they had promised or what they had said they were going to support to COVID relief. Now, COVID relief is very important, but it also affects the most vulnerable communities the most. So if you look at statistics, you'll realize that, gender-based violence has gone up, mental illness has gone up, the climate the issues facing climate change are not going away, even though we are seeing, especially in Asia, really amazing pictures and amazing stories coming out of different countries where emissions have kind of been rolled back as a result of all stop in industrial activity to where they were 10 years ago. The fear, though, Paul, is that when economies are restarting and every country is worried about going into, sort of double-digit recession, we don't start at a cost to the environment. We have managed by an act of nature to actually push back these emissions to where they were a decade ago. But are we going to then reverse these gains by now rushing headlong to try and restart economies without giving a thought to environment? And this is where I think our members can play a role by making sure that, we stick to our promises. We ensure that funding towards ESG targets, funding towards climate action, funding towards gender remains where it was and remains where it was planned.
Thank you for sharing that. The other thing that you're talking about gender and so on, and the impact of COVID environmentally and with people on the ground, of course. One of the things that's come up, a number of conversations, and what we believe is, of course, the importance of involving people with lived experience in helping to determine where these funds are going, where investment should be made. Or Stephen Huddard said a few weeks ago, "Nothing about us without us." Can you share how that is working there with your members and the degree to which they're able to involve people with lived experience in helping to shape the investments?
I think funders, even in Asia now, are realizing that it's extremely important to involve people who have lived experience. Because unless and until, you listen to the ultimate beneficiaries, you are not really kind of achieving the impact with which you design the program in the first place. So what we are now finding, at least, is even in this time of the pandemic, we have seen competitions for innovative ideas to actually address some of the biggest challenges posed by the pandemic, where cases for people with lived experience is very much part of the decision-making process. So I'll give you an example. IMDA, which is an organization in Singapore, has partnered with NVPC, which is the National Volunteer and Philanthropy Center, to organize the COVID-19 and beyond Innovation for Social Good Challenge in Singapore, which actually covers these 6 very specific topics: neighborhood communities, migrant workers access, food rescue, supply chain resources, workforce optimization, and community engagement. And it's actually taking the experience of these people who have lived experience to actually design these programs. So that's where we are finding that, it is important, and people, especially in this time of pandemic, are reaching out and taking this experience into consideration as they're developing their grants.
Well, thank you for sharing that. It also strikes me that's very interesting that, a lot of the work I think that you do and a lot of the thinking around social investment really comes, when I think back to the Grameen Bank.
Yes.
And Mohammed Yunus and his incredible work there. And I think that's still an important point of reference in terms of, and of course it was involving, in that case, women who he was setting up as in microfinance businesses, actually. Yep. What do you see, if you could, of all the things, you're involved in so many different things there and so many different organizations, when you think about the kind of, shining star example of something specific, some investor, some organization, what they're doing that we should all know about, what would that be?
So I very much, Paul, believe that, collaboration is the key. And especially in this time, it is very difficult for any one organization or any one sort of individual or one government to actually go out and solve these problems. It is even much more important to really look together to see what we can do as a collaborative. And one of the collaboratives that I'd like to mention is the COVID Action Collaborative that the Catalyst Group, which is one of our members in India, has done. They've actually brought together over 150 organizations, and this spans, funders, corporates, as well as nonprofits and social entrepreneurs to actually deliver high impact packages to more than 2 million people since the pandemic crisis broke out. And this is right from looking at telehealth to education, to mobilizing neighborhood communities for food delivery, as India went into probably what is one of the most drastic lockdowns in the world, and to looking at how do you actually help the most vulnerable in this time of virus. So the elders and the seniors who are living by themselves without necessarily having support in terms of healthcare or in terms of, just even carrying out their daily chores. How have they managed to support these different types of people by using a community and a collaborative based approach? And I think it's been really, really interesting to see that.
Thank you for sharing that. When you think about businesses there, I mean, one of the things that we're wrestling with is, in a certain way, businesses have responded quickly. As we said, there's an emergency, people have jumped into it, and that's all good. Will there be a different expectation in Asia of the role of businesses in the future?
So I think, of course, like everywhere in the world, we have seen businesses in Asia pivot and look at producing healthcare equipment, whether they be ventilators or they be masks or they be PPE equipment. We've also seen, organizations and corporates in Asia do the same thing. But I think what is going to be much more important as corporates go back to sort of, their original lines of business, and as we look at sort of the economic impact that this virus is going to have longer term on all of our communities, is what kinds of corporate citizens these companies end up being. It's, I think we are finding even the most sort of ardent believers of the capital markets come out and say that it's not about profits anymore or profits alone anymore. It's about really all stakeholders, including the community. But what I do think, Paul, is much more important is how many of these corporates will actually walk that talk, and how many of them are really looking at community support in the communities where they operate in the communities where they do business in, and in the communities where their own investors come from. And that, I think, is what is going to be what sets them apart longer term. I mean, I think a lot of corporates in Asia have announced salary cuts, especially from sort of senior management taking the lead and saying that they are the ones taking the salary cuts, whether they be large organizations like Temasek or Singapore Airlines that have all announced that they are taking these big cuts. But it is also what we are finding out is that what happens to the ones who are lower down in the food chain, and how are they going to be supported by their employers and by these corporates, in the days to come. And I think that's something that all of us need to watch.
Totally. Well, this is why, we talk about change for good, right? And I guess the question is how much of it will there actually be? I'm going to turn it back to AVPN, though, and to your work there in terms of change for good. Tell us about AVPN, what you're doing differently, what the organization is doing differently, what we can expect from AVPN coming up.
So, well, I mean, in this new situation, in 2 weeks, we are going to be holding the largest social investing conference in Asia, and we're going to be holding it online. I sometimes think we're a little crazy because we're going to be doing a 5-day virtual conference from the 8th to the 12th of June. And I hope everyone across the globe will join us. This will be our 8th annual conference for funders and resource providers who are looking to create impact in Asia, but it will be the first time that we are going virtual. Against the backdrop of, what we discussed earlier today, social and economic vulnerabilities, we are choosing to respond in what I think is a very constructive way. More than ever before, I think we need to be reinforcing the support mechanisms that we can all provide in our communities. And we need to build a resilient global community together that is ready for whatever comes next. And I believe that our conference will provide such a platform for investors, business leaders, philanthropists, policymakers, and end beneficiaries who have been isolated at home to get connected, to find collaborative opportunities, to learn and adapt from local and successful best practices, and hopefully get inspired Get inspired by first movers who are creating tangible impact despite the great uncertainties ahead.
Well, thank you so much. And, you know, for everyone watching here today, Naina's been gracious to share the information here. I think everyone should have it on their screens. It's called The Power of Networks. It's coming up from June 8th to 12th. And anyone looking at the screen here can make a note of this. You can get a complimentary ticket. And it's all about partnerships. We have people here from all over the world listening to this webinar. And so I encourage everyone to log on and to participate in what's going to be an incredible conference. Naina, thank you so much. I said the hardest thing about these conversations, they go by so fast. And I know that you and I could talk all day and would love to. So thank you and thank you to your team at AVPN for helping to make this happen. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you again for inviting us. It was wonderful to chat with you.
No, as always. Until next time. But also wanted to thank our team at Impact and who are just doing an incredible job at staying with the course of Change for Good, and it's just a joy to work with everyone there. Also, really looking forward to next week. We'll be speaking with Marcus Lux from the Robert Bosch Stiftung Foundation based in Germany, and he does incredible work there. We'll have a perspective that I think is really special. You'll be able to get a link, I think later today or tomorrow. We'll send to everybody. You can register for that, and really appreciate everyone participating in this ongoing Change for Good conversation. We're learning so much from people like Naina, and we look forward to next week, and we look forward to everybody staying safe. Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.